Sup, bitches? I'm drunk. This is a video. You're gonna watch it, and you're gonna like it. I hope you have your popcorn. So good. Oh wait, hold on. There was a request to have a cat. This is Charles Kitten. He's more of a cat than a kitten. But this is my favorite kitty. He says, hello everyone. My name is Allison and I like cats. Okay? So today we are going to talk about the Battle of Chipyong-ni, which was during the Korean War. So the players are, on the UN side, you have the United States, France, and the South Koreans. On the not the UN side, you have the North Koreans and the Chinese, because we're at the part of the war where the Chinese are involved, just so you know. We got Colonel Freeman, who was the commander of the 23rd Infantry Regiment, and we have Lieutenant Colonel Montclair, who was the commander of the French battalion that was also there at the Battle of Chipyong-ni. And Colonel Freeman is serving under General Ridgway, who is the commander of the 10th Corps, who is also the guy that took after MacArthur. Just to give you some perspective. Chipyong-ni was important geographically. It was like one of those like strategic places. If you want to know more about Chipyong-ni, I prefer, personally, if you would read The Coldest Winter by David Halberstam. This is basically everything you need to know about the Korean War in general. Here's a map of Chipyong-ni so that you understand what we're talking about. To control Chipyong-ni, though, meant to control kind of like these little paths through the mountains that they called the arteries. You know, these like supply lines. They're pretty strategically important. The Battle of Chipyong-ni was a 3-day battle, and it took place from February 13th through 15th, 1951. I know what you're saying, that sounds like 2 days, but it was all day, every day, so that's 3, jackass. This is basically like a really decisive battle as far as the United States is concerned. This is where we learned how to fight the Chinese forces, because we were kind of more into this whole like World War II conventional warfare thing, and they were kind of more into this whole Che Guevara communist guerrilla stuff, because that's what they're really good at. Okay, so, main points. They had 10 days to build up their defenses. Everybody in the 10th Corps was kind of falling apart around them, and Freeman wanted to leave, but Ridgway was like, no, don't leave. We need you there because your very presence, whether or not you all die, is good for us because it prevents Chinese movement from east to west. And it would be a lot harder to reestablish the entire 10th Corps line than it would be to just maintain Chipyong-ni. So stay. And in the end, it was probably a better idea to have them stay because they were so dug in that it was able to save some lives, because it's a lot better to defend from like dug in positions than it is while you're on the retreat, because they were surrounded like that map showed, and they would have had to fight the Chinese no matter what if they wanted to go anywhere at all. Instead of taking all the highest mountains in the area, Freeman decided to take the close mountains, and he didn't want to spread his troops too thin. At the last minute, the 503rd Baker Artillery Battalion showed up, and they took the place of George Company, and George Company had to redo their defenses, and so they were pretty weak, but they also were put in a poor defensive position. They were at the lowest ridge in the area, and it was also a really critical position to defend because it was kind of like pointing at all the other UN positions. So when the fighting started, George Company was the first to go, and from the already made foxholes in George Company, they were able to fire upon the French position and some of the other American positions. And because of shitty communication and like radios and stuff like that, they kept those positions. When you're trying to do a counterattack, especially for people taking over your foxholes, timing is everything. And if you go too soon, you're not going to be able to take it back. And if you go too late, you're not going to be able to take it back. And in this particular instance, they went too late, and they were never able to retrieve those George Company positions throughout the Battle of Chipyong-ni. And the Chinese just kind of took them, and they were like, fuck you bitches. During the battle, Freeman actually got injured, which is kind of just like an interesting tidbit, but he refused to give up his command. He was injured, if I remember correctly, it was either a bullet or shrapnel to the leg. I think it was a bullet to the leg. He was like laying on his cot and he had like just turned his position, and like if he hadn't moved and adjusted, he would have been shot in the head. So it was kind of one of those like, whoa. The really interesting part, though, of the Battle of Chipyong-ni is the really controversial part of the Battle of Chipyong-ni. General Ridgway promised Colonel Freeman that they would be able to get reinforcements up to Chipyong-ni if they needed to, and the reinforcements was going to be Colonel Crombez. And so this segues into Task Force Crombez, which is a really controversial part of the Battle of Chipyong-ni, because on the one hand, a lot of lives were lost, but on the other hand, a lot of lives may have been saved. Basically, Colonel Crombez decided that the way that he was going to bring reinforcement was he was just going to get a tank column and he was going to bum rush through the Chinese. And the way that they were going to get the infantry up there was they were going to put 10 infantrymen on top of every tank. When they inevitably made contact with the Chinese, his brilliant idea was to communicate with radio with the infantrymen about when to get off and when to get back on the tanks. The problem with this brilliant radio plan, though, was they lost the radios. So that's one of the reasons why infantry aren't allowed to ride on tanks anymore. It's kind of a bad idea. But there was another officer who Colonel Crombez told, "You're not going with us to Chipyong-ni," and he was like, "Fuck you, these are my guys. Like, I'm going with you." So Colonel Crombez rode inside of a tank, and so this officer decided to get on top of the back of the last tank. And so the first wave comes and goes, and I'm pretty sure he remounted after the first attack that they had with the Chinese, but it was the second one where he was pinned down and he was with a soldier who was wounded and he didn't want to leave the guy, and so the tank column left without them. Colonel Crombez had also said that there was going to be trucks following the tank column that would pick up the wounded, but the trucks never came. Instead, who came was the Chinese, and so all of the guys who were wounded or who were left behind ended up becoming POWs. And so this officer, who I regretfully cannot remember his name, carried the soldier that he was with, who was a private, who was injured, and he took him to the POW camp with him. And this officer ended up dying in the POW camp because he made sure that all of his men had enough food, and that meant at the expense of himself. So he would give his own food to other people, and he ended up dying of starvation. So I just think that's really sad, and I think that that's really awesome at the same time, because it's not very often that you hear of officers going to those sorts of lengths for their men. That's more of a enlisted man thing to do, and so I feel shitty that I can't remember his name right now, but yeah, he's a hero. He's a real American hero for doing that, so just drink to him. Now, the reason why Task Force Crombez is seen as a positive, despite all the people that died, is because when they finally showed up, just the mere presence of the tank column was enough to scare the Chinese off, and the Chinese basically just scattered. I have a quote from Lieutenant Colonel Montclair, who was, again, the French commander. He said, "When both the defender and the attacker are in peril, the winner of the battle may be the one who can bluff 5 minutes longer than his opponent," which is basically what it came down to. The battle, up until the tank column had arrived, was at a bit of a stalemate. If anything, the UN side was losing. But when the tanks showed up, the Chinese were like, "Fuck this shit," and they got out of there, which was really out of character for the Chinese. Typically, they had superior morale, even though they had inferior equipment. It was because of Chipyong-ni that the UN and the American forces understood and learned how to fight the Chinese forces. They also had a little bit of air support during the Battle of Chipyong-ni. So basically, the new tactic was to let yourself get surrounded, but make sure that you have air support, because if you're surrounded and you're able to get stuff airlifted in, they actually had a little bit of an airstrip. They had enough time to build one with those 10 days. And if you're surrounded and you can get air support to come in and drop you some supplies, then, doing pretty good. After Chipyong-ni, the war kind of was just a continual stalemate, but the lessons learned at Chipyong-ni is largely why America didn't lose. It wasn't a decisive battle in the sense that, this is why we won the war, because we didn't. But it was a decisive battle in that it taught us how to handle the Chinese. So, I hope that you learned something once again. And if you didn't learn anything with this drunk history, you can Google it. So, yeah. A special thanks goes out to my friends Chip, Shell, and Brett for coming up with the intro to today's video, because I couldn't think of anything witty.